A few months back, I stumbled upon this YouTube short by the musical genius that is Jacob Collier. I had to rewatch the clip a couple of times to confirm what I was seeing. Checking the comments under the video not only confirmed the particulars of the performed feat, but it also informed me of the term for it in Western classical music: polyrhythms. Polyrhythms occur when two or more rhythms exist simultaneously. Like most things, it is best understood with an example. So let us consider the 3/4 polyrhythm. We begin with a rhythmic cycle with three equally spaced beats in 3 seconds. Let us introduce another rhythmic cycle, now having 4 beats also spread over 3 seconds. If we superimpose these two rhythmic cycles, we get the 3/4 polyrhythm. Polyrhythms are used extensively by Western percussionists. For example, they might have one rhythm on the snare and another on the cymbal. Needless to say, polyrhythms are non instinctive and extremely challenging. Therefore, even when used, most compositions make use of simpler polyrhythms with the number of beats in either rhythmic cycle not exceeding 5. However, what we just saw Jacob Collier casually demonstrate is the 30-31 polyrhythm. This is how it would look like if you were wondering about the difficulty of the feat. As a student of Carnatic percussion, as soon as I watched this YouTube short, I sat down to try demonstrating polyrhythms with my hands, starting with the simpler ones. I shortly realized that I was making use of concepts that I'm familiar with. So for this video, I thought I would introduce these concepts and demonstrate how they can be applied to recreate polyrhythms. Before we start, I want to give a disclaimer that this is not a novel method to perform polyrhythms, and there are plenty of tutorials on YouTube, some of which use similar techniques. I have linked a couple of them below in the description. My aim for this video is to show how these can be explained in the Carnatic framework, which hopefully, for some of you, serves as a gateway to Carnatic rhythmic theory. The first concept I would like to talk about is a Taala. A Taala is a rhythmic cycle of equispaced beats. There are talas that have beats that are not spaced equally, but that is out of the scope of this video. For our purpose today, a tala is simply a cycle of beats, and the type of tala is specified by the number of beats. We can have talas ranging from one beat cycle all the way to, well, technically there's no upper limit, with some talas having more than 100 beats. But to keep things simple, I will mostly use the tala with 4 beats. And to indicate the start of a cycle, the first beat is marked in red. This is how the 4-beat tala would sound with a metronome. Let us now focus on the beats. While the clapping of hands or a metronome indicates only the start of a beat, in Carnatic music the silence that follows is also very much a part of it. So instead of denoting the beats as discrete circles, I will be representing them with empty boxes that are continuous in time. Though each beat begins right after the previous one ends, I will separate them out for better visualization. Now that we have our empty boxes, let's start filling these with rhythmic syllables or what we call aksharas. Aksharas are syllables that are used to represent notes in Carnatic music. In vocal music or melodic instruments, these are the 7 notes: sa, re, ga, ma, pa, da, ni. In rhythmic theory, however, an akshara is a visual or auditory representation of a stroke that's played on the mridangam, kanjira, tawil, or any other percussion instrument. Going back to our empty boxes, let us focus on one beat and start filling it up with aksharas, which I will be denoting by numbers. There are many ways we can go about doing this. We can fill the entire box with just one akshara, or we can have two aksharas in the beat, or three, and so on. The number of syllables that we choose to fill our beats with is called the Gati. Gati, like the number of beats in a Taala, has no upper bound. However, in practice, it usually ranges from 1 to 8. Though not a direct equivalent, Taala and Gati put together is a rough analog to time signatures in Western classical music. Now, technically, there is no problem denoting the aksharas or syllables by numbers. But numbers in the English language, or most languages for that matter, do not lend themselves phonetically to easy enunciation. Take, for example, a 4 beat cycle with Gati 8. It can get really tricky saying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 rapidly within each beat. So I'll slightly digress from the main theme of this video to introduce the art form Konnakkol. Konnakkol is a unique way of representing rhythmic syllables such that groups of these syllables roll off your tongue easily. In Konnakkol, a single syllable is usually denoted with the sound ta. If I have a rhythmic phrase with two aksharas, instead of saying 1 2, I'll use the Konnakkol equivalent ta ka. Similarly, for three aksharas, I'll be using the phrase ta ki ta. For four aksharas, I'll be using takadimi. For five, takatakita. For six, takatakadimi. For seven, takita takadimi. And finally, for eight aksharas, takadimi takajanu. To illustrate the benefits of using conical syllables over any other randomly chosen syllables like the numbers, let us go back to this rhythmic cycle and replace the numbers with the 8-letter phrase takadimi takajanu. The metronome is set to 90 beats per minute, a pretty high speed for 8 syllables per beat, which is perfect to demonstrate the effectiveness of conical. Takadimi takajanu takadimi takajanu takadimi takajanu takadimi takajanu ta. You could try repeating this, but instead of the Konnakkol phrase, you can use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and you will realize it's not as easy. Let's take stock of everything we have learned so far with a rhythmic exercise in Carnatic music to demonstrate gatis. As mentioned before, we will work with a tala that has 4 beats and set the gati equal to 1 for the first cycle. But instead of fixing our gati, we will increment the number of syllables per beat by 1 after each cycle. The second cycle therefore has gati equal to 2. The third has gati equal to 3, and so on till we reach the cycle having 8 syllables per beat. And of course, we will use the Konnakkol phrases. Ta, 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 taka, 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 takita, 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 takadimi, 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 takatakita, 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 takatakadimi, 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 takita takadimi, takita takadimi, takita takadimi, takita takadimi, takadimi takajana, takadimi takajana, takadimi takajana, takadimi takajana ta. Let us now increase the complexity of this exercise. Instead of changing the Konnakkol phrase each cycle to match the number of syllables per beat, I will select one phrase and recite that in every cycle. Since we are working with a cycle of 4 beats, I am choosing the 4-syllable phrase takadimi. This is to ensure that each cycle ends with the completion of a phrase and not somewhere in the middle. The math behind this is really simple. The total number of aksharas or syllables in a cycle is equal to the number of beats multiplied by the gati. It is also equal to the number of syllables in a phrase multiplied by the number of times that phrase is repeated in the cycle. Since we are fixing the number of beats to 4 and varying the gati, it is convenient to fix the number of syllables in the phrase also to 4, such that the number of takadimis in the cycle is not only a whole number but it is exactly equal to the gati. A cycle with gati 3 will have 3 takadimis over one cycle and so on. This is, however, a significantly harder exercise as the phrases do not always begin on beat. Therefore, before attempting the entire exercise, it is worth considering some of these cycles separately to get used to the length of the phrase not being equal to the gati. This is how the cycle with gati 3 sounds like. Takadimi, 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 ta. For the cycle with gati 5, there are 5 takadimis. Takadimi, 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 ta. And the cycle with Gati 7, which has 7 takadimis, would sound like this. Takadimi, 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 ta. Now this is how the entire exercise sounds like using only the 4-letter phrase takadimi. Ta, ka, di, mi, taka, 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 di, mi, ta. You might have already realized, but each cycle represents a different polyrhythm. That is, we have two rhythmic cycles going on simultaneously. One is the metronome set to 4 beats a cycle, and the other is the repetition of the 4-letter phrase takadimi. Take the Gati 3 cycle for example. We have one rhythmic cycle that iterates over 4 rhythmic units, the beats, over a designated time, and another that iterates over 3 rhythmic units, the 4-letter phrases, over the same time. And this is exactly the 3/4 polyrhythm. There's one last step to make these sound like the polyrhythms that I showed at the beginning of the video, and that is to remove all syllables from our 4-letter phrases apart from the first ones. And this too is another essential concept in Carnatic music called carve. It is not only important to count the syllables that you recite or play, but also those which you don't, but count in silence. This is how it would sound like after removing the silent syllables. Ta, 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 ta. And this should be familiar from earlier on in the video. We have now basically developed an algorithm to reproduce any polyrhythm under the framework of Carnatic rhythm. Let us go through it one more time by considering the 3/5 polyrhythm. There are two ways of getting there. We can either choose a Taala with 3 beats and set the Gati to 5, or have a Taala with 5 beats with Gati equal to 3. We fill the first cycle with 5 takitas, the 3-letter phrase, while the second cycle gets 3 repetitions of the 5-letter phrase takatakita. We suppress the syllables apart from the first one in each phrase, and we have our 3/5 polyrhythm two ways. Ta, 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 ta. The only difference between the two is the interchange of the sounds of the metronome and the recited syllable. The final thing remaining to demonstrate polyrhythms using your hands, like we saw Jacob Collier do, is to maintain the metronome with one hand and transfer the recitation of the syllable to the other. As someone who is not used to keeping rhythm with both hands at the same time, this was a challenge initially, but after a couple of hours of persistent practice, I got a hang of it. Or well, I at least think I did. While Carnatic percussionists do not usually employ polyrhythms in the Western sense, change of gati is common during performances. Like this instance in which G. Harishankar, one of India's greatest drummers, plays a complex rhythmic composition set to 4 syllables a beat once, and then plays the same composition in gati equal to 6 thrice. On the topic of changing Gati, I'd like to bring up this scene from the Kannada movie Hamsageethe. The main vocalist sings the composition Himadri Sute Pahimam by Saint Shama Shastri set to two syllables per beat. Upon completion, his student asks him if he, the student, could now sing the same composition in Trishra, that is the technical term for Gati equal to 3. The teacher refuses this request, stating that the composer has already set the Taala and Gati for the composition. However, he finally relents and lets his disciple sing the composition, now set to 3 syllables per beat. And what follows is a very unique rendition of the composition by the late great Dr. Balamurali Krishna, playback singer for the disciples' rendition. Hearing the two renditions, one can appreciate how changing the Gati brings about a totally different flavor of the composition. I have linked this clip of the scene below and would highly recommend you to check it out. Finally, let us go back to the Jacob Collier video. A 30-31 polyrhythm would mean using a Gati of 30 or 31. Is it really possible to effectively divide each beat down to 30 or 31 units? I would venture a guess that a far likelier explanation is that he's exploiting the fact that 30 and 31 are consecutive integers. So when you map out the polyrhythm, you can see that the duration between a beat from the 30 beat cycle to the corresponding beat in the 31 beat cycle goes on increasing till the two cycles align once again. Sean Crowder too came up with the same idea in his video on playing the 21-22 polyrhythm. But then, I wouldn't be surprised if Jacob Collier's polyrhythm is precise. As the great composer Saint Tyagaraja said, Endaro Mahanubhavulu, Andiriki Vandanamulu. There are truly great people in this world. My salutations to them all.